Pop culture is full of plot lines about what this or that generation is like. Think of the now famous millennial comment, "Okay, boomer," and what that shorthand apparently conveys about both generations. Bobby Duffy is a professor of public policy and director of the Policy Institute at King's College London. His new book wants to put the brakes on some of that easy pigeonholing. It's called The Generation Myth: Why, When You're Born, Matters Less Than You Think. And Bobby Duffy joins us now from London, UK, to explain. Bobby, it's good to have you on our program. How are you doing?
Really good. Great to be here. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for making time for us. It has been such a tried, tested, and apparently true fact that so much of society is categorized and explained by what generation you're born into, and you are trying to get us to reconsider what is, I think, a very deeply held view. So where did the notion come to you that there may be more myth than reality to this whole generation thing?
Yeah, I suppose if I was trying to sum up the book in one sentence, it's that generational thinking is a really big idea in the history of sociology and philosophy, but it's been horribly corrupted by loads of stereotypes, myths, and cliches. And I suppose my genesis of starting to research that came from seeing very important patterns that were different between generations, but then them getting lost in this mess of stereotypes and myths and cliches, all those things around the latest thing that millennials are supposed to have killed or that baby boomers are supposed to have ruined. And it kind of degrades what is a really big idea for understanding how societies change. These myths and stereotypes get in the way of that.
You say corrupted. Whose motive would be served by corrupting this notion that we've all been living under?
Oh, it's a really good question, because it's sort of, there are people that are motivated to emphasize difference between generations. So there are consultants who actually make a living out of telling you that generations are different from each other, and you need their advice in order to understand how to engage, particularly the latest generation. So there are, in fact, there's 400 people on LinkedIn who call themselves just millennial consultants or millennial experts. So they're part of the issue, but they're not really the biggest part. That's a $70 million a year business in the US. So it's big, but it's not huge. Really, it's all of those press releases and headlines that you see in the media and social media that sum up vast swathes of the population in one or two adjectives or in one or two behaviors. It's a really easy shorthand story to categorize ourselves and how we are different from other people. So in the end, really, it's down to how we like to tell these stories about ourselves, who we are and who we are not. So it's a very human need to categorize, and these generational labels really play to that.
Well, let's just be clear about what you are saying, and then maybe even more clear about what you're not saying, because I think one of the most famous, he will not like my using this expression, but talking heads on Canadian television over the last 4 decades is a guy by the name of David Foote, who wrote a book called Boom, Bust, and Echo, which has been sort of widely praised for many decades as you know, sort of the Bible on how generational thinking explains not everything, but so much. Are you essentially saying he got it wrong?
No, I think there is really good generational analysis, and in order to understand how societies change, you really need to understand what is truly different between generations, through the simple fact that if there's a real difference between one generation and the new one coming through, then that is inevitably going to affect the future, because that older generation is dying out and being replaced by a new generation with different attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors. And that's really important to understand. What I try to do in the book is to say that society changes in 3 main ways. You have those cohort effects, as they're called, where a generation is different from other generations and stays different. But you also have life cycle effects, where we change as we age. You don't stay exactly as you are throughout your life. Your beliefs and behaviors adapt as you get older and go through particular life stages, and understanding that is important too. And then the third type of effect are period effects, where something happens and it affects all of society to some degree, and everyone changes. So there's the change in societies and interplay of those 3 effects. Things like the period effects would be things like the pandemic, for example. So it's not that generational thinking is unimportant. It's just not the whole story. And you need to understand the interplay between those three different effects if you really want to understand the future.
Just as an example, for period effects, if you're alive and sort of aware during 9/11, that would be something that affected everybody, not just one particular generation. Fair to say?
Yes, exactly. So that's a classic of a period effect, and people kind of point to that as a marker in history before and after 9/11. And we'll see the same with the COVID pandemic, as how life changed entirely pre and post that. So yes, these are really, these can change the direction of societies, and they're not captured in generational thinking. There's not purely about cohorts. It affects everyone who's alive during that type of period. But it does also depend on what age you are at those times. There is truth in that. The core of generational thinking is that we're more malleable when we're in our formative years, in our late teens and early 20s. They do set us on a course for life, and in a way that you don't get it at later stages. So it is important how old you are when those events happen in terms of how they form you, but it's not determinate. And you have to look at the interplay between those three effects if you really want to understand how societies shift.
And I suspect people know this already, but just for clarity's sake, let's just stipulate here that, well, here are the 5 generational groups that you're talking about. Pre-war, which is born before 1945, World War II. The baby boomers, who were born after the war, 1945 to 64, 65, something like that. Generation X, 1966 to 79. Millennials, 1980 to 95. And then Generation Z, 1996 to 2010. And then there's sort of a question mark after 2010, because I guess there's some confusion as to when the cutoff is to be part of Generation Z. Why is there confusion about that?
Well, I mean, it's just a natural phenomenon when these types of generations are coming through. The newest generation, you want to see how they're growing up, and actually also what happens, what are the events that may be shaping them. So it's quite common for generational definitions to shift over time when you look back and you think, actually, that is a better point at which to make a break between one generation and the next. And again, it's really important to understand when you're thinking about generations that clearly they're blurry around the edges, and that people that are born near the boundary have more in common with people that are in another generation, but just the other side of that boundary. These are not really highly determinate divisions between them, and we shouldn't really get too caught up on exactly when the age breaks are. In some ways, when the birth year breaks are, because these should be thought of as broad sweeps that give you an idea of how societies and individual cohorts are changing. They're not precise measurements, but that's quite common across all sorts of demographic divisions, from social class to income. To whatever it is, where you put the boundaries is, in all of these classifications, slightly arbitrary. The key test is, does it tell you something useful about society and how it's changing? And I think used well, generations can do, but unfortunately, more often than not, they're just used to propagate myths.
I want to play a clip for you now. This is from a program that we did here on TVO. We called it Generation Divided. And I guess it was just over a couple of years ago. And a fellow by the name of Navneet Alang, who's a technology and culture writer for the Toronto Daily Star. They don't call it the Daily Star anymore. The Toronto Star, which is the biggest circulation newspaper in the country. He's a member of Gen X. And here's what he had to say on this generational conflict. Sheldon, roll it, please.
I think that generational conflict is usually a symptom of anxiety, right? It's about a symptom of how things are changing, and I think that we're living at a particularly rapid period of change. Something that always sticks out in my head is that there are more people on social media now than were alive at the beginning of the Second World War. So that that's something that has happened in the past 15 or 20 years. And I think that kind of change, in which the day-to-day habits of people have changed so quickly, produces a kind of understandably anxious response. And I think that plays out in how we think about different generations.
What's your response to his notion that anxiety is at the basis of a lot of this?
Yeah, this goes back to the origins of the big thinkers around generation. So people like Karl Mannheim, who was a Hungarian sociologist who gave us a lot of how we think about generations even today. He was writing at the beginning of the 20th century. And what Mannheim was writing in a period where there was a great deal of conflict between different generations, because the young people of that day, particularly in Europe, had felt deep resentment to being sacrificed in the First World War against older generations who were sending them out to this war. So this generational thinking has a deep root in that sense of conflict or tension between generations, that one generation is defined, the younger generations in particular, are defined by those types of traumatic events. And then the second point that was made there was about the importance of technology and change. And that's also really important to how generations are formed and how different they are from other generations. Because when technology is changing rapidly, then you can understand that the gaps between generations can grow bigger. If nothing was moving forward, if there was no development in society, then you wouldn't be as different from your parents and grandparents as you otherwise would be. So so both of those things about distance and sense of tension between generations and the speed of change, including in technology in society, those are important factors in how generations are formed and then how much conflict there is between generations.
I kind of like your take on this next point, which is that so many people nowadays, if they're liberal, they only want to hang out with liberals. If they're conservatives, they only want to hang out with conservatives. We appear to be more tribal now than at any point in, well, certainly my lifetime. And I wonder whether that perhaps motivates so much of this. I'm a boomer, I don't want to have anything to do with those Gen X people, or I'm a Gen Z person, and all of you pre-war people are stealing my wealth, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, in my day job as King's College London, my main area of focus is around polarization and culture wars in some senses, and whether they're coming into the UK or other countries in Europe, and the extent to which we've got those types of greater divisions. And I think it is certainly the case that there are worrying signs that we have polarized more around our tribal identities in a way that has been talked about and discussed a lot in the US, but maybe less so elsewhere until more recently. And we have got that sense of being on one side or the other that is not to do, well, a key point about this is it's not to do with a particularly strange generation of young people coming through right now. You'll get a lot of claims that we've got an unusual generation of social justice warriors or snowflakes coming through that are more likely to have a problem with older people. That would be a cohort effect if it was a true difference between generations. But what I argue in the book is it's actually a period effect of we've got a very different media and social media environment now, an information environment generally, which is incentivized to amplify the more extreme views. So we know more emotional, conflict-driven views travel further and faster on social media than more moderate views. So we got this sense of great division between groups, but it's not to do with a big generational difference. It's to do with this period effect of the information environment we're living in now that gives us this impression of division between people, which can turn into a reality, that we are getting a greater sense of those tribal identities around politics, but then other issues coming into it too. So yeah, I do worry about that. But we got to not misdiagnose it, and particularly not blame it on younger generations being weird. That is a constant of history. You can go back all the way to Socrates, who thought the young people in his day were the worst generation of young people ever. But every era of history thinks the same, that this generation of young people are particularly weird or wrong. And that's not the case. It's much more to do with this period effect of fractious politics, media, and social media.
Let me ask you about housing, and you've got a chapter in the book about this, and of course this is one of the huge cleavage points in society today, where a lot of older people have housing, are getting rich off their housing, and many younger people can't get into the market at all. And you referenced this Monty Python sketch, which is pretty famous, and let's play a snippet of that, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would.
We used to get up in morning at 10:30 at night, half an hour before we'd gone to bed. eat a lump of poison, work 29 hours a day at mill for 8 year lifetime, come home and each night Dad would strangle us and dance about on our graves.
All right, will you try and tell that to the young people of today? Will they believe you? No.
What does that sketch tell us about how the older generation views the younger generation's take on housing?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So yeah, the Four Yorkshiremen sketch from Monty Python, that would actually have been the baby boomers' parents when that was first set. And that's the baby boomers' parents telling the baby boomers they don't know how good that they've had it. So you see this repeats throughout history. But I mean, the reality on housing is a real step change in people's ability to buy and own their own home. This is I plot these people's life stories in some ways in the charts in the book, where I follow a generation as it ages, each successive generation. And you can see in the US, in the UK, in lots of other countries, you can see Generation X, my generation, looking like it was going to go up and join baby boomers and the pre-war generation at a similar sort of level of home ownership, and then just get deflected away from that. Instead of ending up at 80%, they kind of deflected away in the early 2000s to end up at about 60% of the population, of the Gen X population, owning their own home. And then millennials come in a few years later and never get going, and only around 40% of them owning their own home in both the US and the UK. And you can see this incredible difference in an expected life course and story, just due to the fact of being born at a particular point in time. Those generations or those cohorts had been born 10 or 20 years earlier, they could have expected a very different life story in terms of home ownership, which has become hugely important to our private wealth. The economic story of the past 20 or 30 years has been the importance of wealth, the growing importance of private wealth as opposed to income, and in how well off we feel. And housing has been such a key part of that growth in private wealth, but big chunks of the younger generations locked out of that, not because of their socioeconomic status or where they are, but just purely because of when they were born. And that is a big problem. One of the big things, if we want to paint a better future for coming generations, we really do need to address that housing issue. One of the shocking things that we found as part of this book is we used to think, and the majority of us used to think, that the future was going to be better for young people than it was for their parents in countries like the UK, the US, and Canada. But now that's reversed, and only around a quarter of us think that the future is going to be better for younger generations coming through. And that's really quite shocking when you think about it, because it's very important to us as parents and grandparents, for the whole of society, that you've got that sense of progress for your children, and we're losing that sense of that, and some of those economic factors are key to that.
Let's do a bit of a lightning round here. I want to take you through a bunch of issues that you raise in the book, and you just sort of give me, top of mind answers to this, if you would. Mental illness, suicide, drug addiction. Which generation does your research show struggles with this the most?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It is. There are no suicide epidemics among young people right now. That is, you'll see headlines about that, but actually that is not the case. And suicide is much more of a middle-aged thing, and actually more of a Generation X. If you're looking for a cohort, it's more of a Generation X thing. Maybe because we haven't had such a good economic time, but we also don't have the same sort of openness about our mental health as younger generations may do. But similarly, in contrast to that, mental health problems, mental health disorders, that is a serious issue among younger generations, and particularly younger generations of women. So that is something that people are blaming on media, social media and mobile phones, those types of things. It's not entirely clear that that is the causal factor here, but it is something we should be taking really, really seriously. There has been a step change in the experience of mental health disorders among younger generations coming through right now, and that's a serious issue that we need to focus a huge amount of attention on.
How about attitudes on race or LGBTQ rights, that kind of thing? Fair to say that Gen Z and millennials are more progressive on this than older people?
Again, really interesting question, because what I see in the data is that on issues like homosexuality and race, not a huge difference between young and old. These are kind of issues that have been in discussion in society for some time, and we've made a lot of progress on those types of attitudes. What you find is more that each emergent issue that comes through, whether that is gender identity or support for particular movements like Black Lives Matter, you are still seeing a gap between younger generations and older generations on that. But that is a natural aspect of society. Each emergent social issue or social norm, it's always the younger generation that are more comfortable with those types of change. And that's because they've not been configured to society's existing attitude. So that's really good for society. Some demographers, Canadian demographers, in fact, talk about it as a type of demographic metabolism that keeps society fresh, having this younger generation come through. But there's not the big gaps between young and old on older issues like homosexuality or race, as you might think from some of the headlines. We've moved a long way as a society as a whole on lots of those types of attitudes.
How about on climate change? As big a chasm between young and old as we think?
No, again, one of the most important myths to debunk on generational differences that older people don't care about climate change or the environment. It's when I look at the data, there is a little bit of a gap. Younger generation is more likely to say it's extremely dangerous and we should do something about it. But the gaps are tiny, a few percentage points really now, whereas the headlines and the discussion of this, it makes it sound like we've got a chasm, as you say, between young and old. When Time magazine made Greta Thunberg their person of the year, they called her an avatar in a generational battle between old and young. And that's not really the case in activism, but also in general attitudes. In fact, older groups, Gen X and baby boomers, are more likely to boycott products or services for social purpose reasons than younger people, just because that's a kind of life stage thing. It's more of a life cycle effect. So no, and I think this is a particularly important one to debunk, because we're telling older people that they don't care about the environment. That's the message that gets sent. And if we've got any cause that needs people to come together rather than to make up fake divisions between generations, it's on climate, because we all need to act on that. So it's really important to get that one right.
I guess just in our last minute here, when you talk about fake divisions, it's probably worth remembering that, and I'll just take baby boomers for argument's sake, you know, a white male baby boomer and a black female baby boomer may be in that same generation, but holy smokes, they have a pretty different understanding of what reality is, right?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think that's a crucial point, is that within these generations, there are huge variations. And then my book is international, so it's looking across lots of different countries, and quite a lot of my conclusions are that your country's culture still comes before what generation you're in. There is big gaps, much bigger gaps between countries than there are between generations on many of these factors. So yes, generations can't sum up that vast variety of experience and behaviors and attitudes and beliefs that you see across these vast swathes of the population. So yeah, I think what I tried to say in the book, though, is generation still can be important within that. What we really need to look at is the interaction between those demographic things like race, socioeconomic things like income and wealth, and the generation you're in. There's a really complex interplay between those different types of things, where generation does play a role, but only a partial role.
Well, we always like having guests on this program who challenge the prevailing narratives, because it makes us think, and we like that here at TVO. So, Bobby Duffy, we want to thank you for joining us tonight. Your book is called The Generation Myth: Why When You're Born Matters Less Than You Think. Good to have you on the line from London, England. Thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.